Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us.
Always a pleasure.
Today we're tackling a topic that really gets to the heart of some, I think, really core societal questions
Absolutely.
about government control, individual freedom, and how those sometimes, butt heads when it comes to really hot button social issues.
Yeah, and often how they shouldn't.
Yeah, exactly. So to guide our deep dive today, we're looking at an article by Larken Rose, and he's wading into a pretty controversial subject,
Oh,
the
yeah.
debate about transgender athletes in women's sports.
Mm,
Um, but here's the thing. He's saying that maybe the bigger issue isn't the policy itself, but how we as a society deal with these kinds of disagreements in the first place.
right. Yeah, so it's not even like taking a side on this one policy or the other. It's like, how are we even, like, what's the system we're using to try and figure this out as a complete
Exactly.
group?
Yeah, and that's kind of what we're going to be exploring
Yeah.
in this deep dive.
Yeah, and Rose is very clear in his article that, like, he's not trying to be, ambiguous about where he stands.
Right.
He believes that it's unfair for biological males to compete in women's sports.
Okay.
But he actually argued that forcing his viewpoint, like, through government control is not the answer.
Interesting. So if not using the government as a tool to kind of solve this problem, what does he suggest?
Well, he actually proposes, like, an alternative approach
Okay.
to these kinds of disagreements, and he calls it freedom of association and disassociation.
Okay, so break that down for me. What does that actually look like?
Yeah, so basically, private organizations
Okay.
should have the power to set their own rules and regulations.
Hmm.
And if people disagree with those rules and regulations, they can choose to support other organizations.
Okay.
They can create their own, or they can just simply not participate.
So it's kind of like voting with your wallet, but on a much larger societal level.
Exactly. It's applying that concept across a wider range of choices.
Interesting.
And so this is where Rose brings up the issue of government funding.
Okay.
And he makes this argument that when taxpayer dollars are involved, it forces everyone into the debate,
Right?
even if they don't want to be.
Because your tax money is going toward it,
Exactly.
whether you support that particular policy or not.
Exactly. So that element of free choice is kind of removed from the equation.
Yeah, you're stuck in the
Right.
system in a way.
Yeah, and Rose argues that this can actually create a breeding ground for conflict, and it puts the government in the position of being like this ultimate decision maker.
Right?
And he sees that as potentially problematic.
Okay, so how does this actually play out in a real-world scenario?
Well, Rose uses the example of Donald Trump's actions surrounding transgender athletes in Maine.
Ah, yes, I remember this.
So just to recap,
Yeah.
Trump basically confronted Maine officials,
Right.
threatening to withhold federal funding if they didn't fall in line with his stance on transgender athletes.
Yeah, essentially using the power of the purse
Exactly.
as a way to force compliance.
Right, and now a lot of conservatives actually applauded this move.
Right, they were very happy about it.
But Rose raises a really interesting point here. He's saying that celebrating this tactic, regardless of whether you agree with Trump's position or not, actually sets a dangerous precedent.
Because it sidesteps the Constitution.
Right. So Rose points out that the U.S. Constitution doesn't actually give the federal government the power to just dictate social policy on this level.
Okay, so that's a problem right there, potentially.
Right. And Rose takes it even a step further.
Okay.
He brings up a Supreme Court case from 1936,
Okay.
United States v. Butler.
Okay.
And in this case, the court actually ruled against the federal government using funding to indirectly control things that weren't within its jurisdiction.
So how does this case connect back to what we were talking about with Trump and transgender athletes?
Well, United States v. Butler essentially established this precedent against this type of like coercive control through funding. So Rose is arguing that Trump's actions, while celebrated by some, were essentially employing the same tactic,
Okay.
using federal funding to enforce a specific social policy, and that potentially oversteps constitutional limits.
So it's like using the money as leverage to get what you want, even if it goes against the intended structure of government.
Exactly. And, some people might argue that, well, this for the greater good, this was about, protecting women's sports.
Right.
But Rose's point is that the method itself, using government force, is the problem.
Okay.
Because what happens when a future leader
Right.
uses that same tactic?
To push something you don't agree with.
Exactly. If we accept this as a valid tactic, it creates a system where the government can essentially control any social issue just by threatening to withhold funds.
That's a scary thought. And he's not just talking about this one issue, right?
No, this applies to
It
everything.
applies to
Everything. You think about DEI policies, gun control, medical decisions, the list goes on and on.
Wow.
And suddenly we're not arguing about policy anymore. We're actually in a battle for like the very essence of freedom
Right.
and limited government.
It's about the principle
Exactly.
of the thing
Yes.
and the danger that we as citizens might be missing the forest for the trees.
Yeah, we get so focused on our own side winning
Right.
that we don't even realize that we're actually contributing to a system that could ultimately undermine the very things that we claim to value.
And that's what Rose is warning us about.
Exactly. And he suggests that when we celebrate these tactics, even for causes that we agree with,
Right.
we might actually be cheering for the expansion of government control.
That's a good place to stop for part one.
Okay.
We'll pick this back up in just a minute.
Sounds good.
So we're kind of falling into this trap where we focus on individual issues
Yeah.
instead of maybe the bigger picture of how these things are actually being controlled.
Yeah, Rose refers to this as like a cyclical trap.
Okay.
It's this idea that governments will create or worsen problems and then they'll present themselves as the solution, using often authoritarian methods. And we, the public, end up begging for more government control out of fear or frustration.
So it's like we become addicted to this quick fix.
Yeah.
Even if it comes at the expense of some of our freedoms.
Exactly. And the cycle just kind of keeps repeating itself.
And how does this relate back to the example we were talking about before?
Yeah, so like with the transgender athlete issue, like the government's involvement in funding those organizations
Right.
is part of what's creating this controversy in the first place.
Okay.
But then the proposed solution is often more government intervention.
So we're playing right into their hands.
Yeah, it's like we're so busy fighting over the symptoms
Right.
that we forget to address the root cause.
And history has shown that governments rarely give up power once they've gained it.
Right, like it's much easier to expand control than it is to give it back. And Rose uses this really powerful analogy. He says, giving the government power today because you trust them to do what you want is like giving a child a loaded gun because you're confident he won't shoot anyone you like.
Okay, so is he saying then that any government involvement is a bad thing?
Not necessarily. He acknowledges that, there will always be disagreements. There will always be difficult issues to address.
Yeah.
But his point is that we need to be extremely cautious about relying on government force as the solution. He wants us to kind of think beyond these like political band-aids and consider the long-term consequences of expanding government control.
Okay, so if we can't rely on the government to solve these complex social problems, then what are our options?
Well, Rose offers a pretty radical call to action.
Okay.
He says if we truly value freedom, we need to stop cheering for government force, even when it aligns with our own beliefs.
Okay.
And he suggests we shift our focus from demanding government action to taking more responsibility for our choices and actions.
As individuals?
As individuals, as communities, yeah.
Okay, so that's a pretty big ask.
Yeah.
It sounds like he's advocating for a complete withdrawal from the political system.
Not quite. He's not saying we should, abandon all forms of civic engagement. But he is saying that true freedom requires a commitment to defending the principles of individual liberty, even when it's difficult, even when it's unpopular.
So instead of just immediately calling for the government to step in, what are some concrete steps that we can take to address these issues?
Well, he outlines a few specific actions.
Okay.
The first one is if you disagree with a policy or an organization, instead of petitioning the government to step in, withdraw your support.
Okay.
Don't fund it, don't participate, and make your dissent known through your actions.
So kind of going back to that voting with your wallet.
Exactly. But what about broader societal issues?
Right, because you can't just
Right.
not pay taxes or something.
Right. So his second point is about being proactive.
Okay.
If you oppose a movement or an ideology instead of trying to get the government to shut it down,
Okay.
build a better alternative.
Okay, so not just tearing down what you dislike,
Yeah.
but creating something new.
Exactly. Prove the superiority of your ideas through persuasion, positive action, community building, not by using force or coercion.
But I imagine that's a lot harder than just demanding that the government fix everything.
Oh, yeah. It definitely requires more effort and a willingness to engage in those difficult conversations. But he argues it's the only way to protect individual liberty in the long run.
So it's about building a better world from the ground up,
Yeah,
instead of relying on these top-down government solutions.
exactly. And his third point is maybe the most challenging,
Okay.
but it really gets to the heart of what it means to truly champion freedom.
And what is that?
He says we need to be willing to defend freedom even when it protects things we personally find distasteful.
Ooh, that's tough.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Because it's easy to say, I support free speech,
Right.
but only when it's speech that I agree with.
Exactly. But he's saying that if we only defend freedom when it benefits us or aligns with our beliefs, we're not really defending freedom at all. We're simply advocating for our own preferences, and that can be just as tyrannical as any government overreach.
So it's about consistency and principle,
Yeah, defending the right of others to make their own choices, even if we think those choices are wrong or even harmful.
which requires a lot of trust in people
It
to
does.
make good choices.
It does, and it requires intellectual humility
Yeah.
and a willingness to recognize that our own deeply held beliefs might be wrong.
And also accepting that sometimes people will make what we perceive to be bad choices,
Right.
but that's their right to make those choices.
Exactly. And Rose argues that trusting individuals to make their own choices, even if they make mistakes, is ultimately less dangerous than handing that power over to the government.
Because once the government has it,
They don't let it go.
okay, so we've talked about the problems of government overreach and some potential alternatives.
Right.
But where does Rose see all of this heading?
Well, he ends his discussion with a pretty stark warning.
Okay.
He says the worst thing you can do is believe a politician will save you.
Okay, so that's a pretty bold statement.
It is.
What does he mean by that?
Well, he believes that politicians, regardless of their party or their stated intentions, are ultimately driven by the pursuit and consolidation of power. And they will use any problem, any crisis, any social division as an opportunity to expand their control.
So it's not about demonizing any particular politician or party.
No.
It's about understanding how the system itself works.
Exactly. And he argues that this constant cycle of looking to the government to solve our problems is actually feeding the beast. So we're giving them more power even when we think we're fighting for our own interests.
Okay, so what's the action step here for our listeners?
I think Rose's challenge to us is to break the cycle, take responsibility for your own choices, for your communities, for your lives,
Okay.
and stop expecting the government to fix every problem, especially when it comes to social issues and cultural disagreements.
Because if we don't,
The government will continue to grow, it'll expand its reach, it'll intrude further into our lives until, as Rose puts it, it controls everything.
so this is not just some abstract political theory. This has
No.
real-world implications.
Absolutely, and it's a conversation I think it's more relevant now than ever.
This has been such a fascinating discussion.
It has.
I mean, we started with this, very specific debate around transgender athletes. But it's clear that Larken Rose is kind of tapping into something much bigger here.
Oh, yeah.
It's about this, creeping government overreach
Right.
and the danger that we might be, creating these political solutions that actually end up eroding our freedom in the long run.
It's like we're so caught up in this tug of war,
Right.
Constantly battling over these specific policies,
Right.
but we don't realize that the rope itself is fraying.
We're too busy fighting over the symptoms to see
Right.
the bigger picture.
Exactly. And I think Rose is arguing that we're actually contributing to this problem by constantly, looking to the government to step in and fix everything.
Right. We think we're advocating for positive change.
Yeah.
But we might actually be feeding a system that thrives on control.
Yeah, and it's a tough pill to swallow,
Right.
especially when we're, passionate about these causes.
Right.
But I think his point is that we need to be more critical and ask ourselves, is government intervention really the best solution here?
Right.
Or are there, alternative ways to address this?
That might actually be better in the long run.
Exactly. And might be less, harmful to individual liberty.
So maybe instead of just jumping on that bandwagon and saying, the government needs to fix this,
Right.
we need to step back and say, okay, well, what are the unintended consequences of that?
Right.
What are the, potential downsides here?
Right.
And are there other ways that we can achieve this goal without giving the government even more power?
Exactly. And that requires a shift in mindset.
Right.
We have to move away from this mentality of us versus them.
Right.
And recognize that, expanding government power, even for a cause we support,
Right.
can backfire.
Yeah.
It can be used against us in the future.
What goes around comes around.
Exactly.
If we're willing to use the government to, force our way today,
Right.
we shouldn't be surprised if that same power is used against us tomorrow.
Right. And I think that's why Rose advocates for this idea of, individual responsibility and community-based solutions as the most sustainable way to create lasting change.
So empowering people
Yeah.
to find their own solution.
Exactly. It's about, giving people the tools and the resources to build their own communities, to shape their own destinies.
Which is a much more proactive approach.
It is.
And it probably requires a lot more patience.
Oh, yeah. It definitely requires, more work and effort on our part.
But in the long run, it might be the only way
Yeah.
to really create a, truly free and equitable society.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are your final thoughts?
I think what really struck me was Rose's call for a more nuanced
Yeah.
and critical approach to politics in general. It's so easy to get caught up in the, emotion of an issue
Right.
and demand immediate action.
Yeah.
But I think he's right. We need to kind of step back, think about those long-term consequences,
Right.
and ask ourselves, Are there better ways to do this?
Yeah, and maybe even more importantly, are there ways to do this that don't involve giving the government more power over our lives?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a constant learning process, questioning, adapting, and it starts with each of us taking responsibility for our own actions and choices.
Well said. And on that note, we're going to wrap up this episode of the Deep Dive.
Okay.
But the conversation certainly doesn't end here. We encourage you to, explore Larken Rose's work
Yeah.
and to continue questioning the role of government in our lives.
Absolutely. And as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts, share your insights, your questions, your challenges. Let's keep this dialogue going and work together to create a future where individual freedom truly flourishes.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks everyone.